evening and welcome back to Thai PBS World. Tonight you are watching special edition of the standoff between protester and the police officer right now in the heart of Bangkok at the Urupong intersection. So let's see what's happening right now.
So this is the latest scene at the spot known as the Urupong intersection, which is less than 1 kilometer away from the government house, which is the destination of the protesters. The protesters, maybe thousands of them, marched from the Victory Monument where they had to rally earlier in the afternoon, and then walked their way from there heading for the government house. And now they are being stopped at the spot at the Urupong intersection near the Yombarat flyover, if you're familiar with that area. And this spot is only a short distance from the government house.
According to the protester, they call it a big surprise to be moving from Victory Monument to the government house today, and they just moved at about 6 p.m. And at about 7 p.m., the Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha had TV2 press conference and to tell the stance of the government and ask for protesters to be back off. And he said that each party has to take one step back and try to talk to one another.
It looks like the Prime Minister's speech did nothing to calm down the protesters. The Prime Minister said in the speech that he is considering ending the state of emergency if there is no more violence. It's not a promise, but it's a condition that no violence, then he will lift the state of emergency. We don't know exactly what is going on right now at this very spot, but it looks like the protesters have the intention to march toward the government house as they have threatened. And the leadership of the protest today is still a big question mark. We haven't seen any clear leaders looking after the protesters yet, but of course it looks like words were sort of passed, words of mouth, from one person to another as to what the protester will do.
And as far as you can see, the protesters wearing different colors of the helmet, and especially at the front line that they have standing off between protester and police officer. The protester would wear white helmet in particular, and those are volunteers to be at the front line of the protester. So right now you see how protesters are moving toward Urupong intersection. And that's the spot in which they would like to be heading to the government house. But that's where the front line of the standoff between police officer and protester are at the moment at Urupong intersection.
Not all the protesters you're seeing march from the Victory Monument. Many march from other spots where they had rallied earlier as designated by the protest organizers. And as always, which has been the case the past few days, that all the rallies today have been organized through social media. And it came as a surprise to most people that the destination for the protester today would be the government house. It was never mentioned by the protesters that they would march to the seat of the government.
The way they make a decision and they announce through Telegram application was quite fast, Kun Thepchai, and they didn't tell one another beforehand. But there must be some leaders who make a decision and announce and communicate with the protester on Telegram application.
In front of them is the line of police supported by the concrete barriers ringing around the seat of the government. If you remember, it was last week on Wednesday night that the protesters were able to break the barriers and managed to have a sit-down protest in front of the government house overnight before they dispersed the next morning. Just give you some sense of the location of this place. You can see on the smaller screen that the Yomarat flyover, and below that there are the rail tracks that we normally come across when we drive past that spot.
Yeah. It's quite chaotic and very packed and very crowded with protesters right now gathering at the Upong intersection.
It's still unclear what the protesters or the organizers of the protester want today. Of course, they made it clear that they want to march to the government house and to repeat the demands, but exactly what they want to do is still unclear. And as you can see, that many of the protesters, or even most of them, we can say, that are young people, university or high school students, many among them.
Yes, and they met today at about 4 o'clock. That was after school time. And firstly, they met at Victory Monument first, before announcing that they would like to march to the government house. And they started moving at about just before 6 o'clock. And at 7:15, Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha addressing the nation, the whole nation. He says he is preparing to lift the state of severe emergency soon, as long as there is no violence. Prime Minister assured protesters that their voices have been heard, noting that the Parliament will hold a special session on 26th of October and 27th of October, and he asked demonstrators to give him a lawmaker some time to discuss solutions.
The Prime Minister also called on all sides to take a step back to avoid more damage to the country. He said, at this point, we all need to take a step back from the brink, away from the path that would plunge Thailand into a disaster, he said in the address. And he said, all the voices and demands of the protesters have been heard, and they should allow the legislative branch to do its work in diffusing what he admitted is a potentially explosive situation.
He asked protesters to reciprocate with sincerity, to turn down the volume of hateful and divisive talk, and to let us together disperse this terrible dark cloud before it moves over our countries. That's what he says. While he was addressing the whole nation, thousands of protesters were marching to the government house, and this is what you are watching.
He tried to strike a compromising stand, saying that as the government leader, he is now taking a step back. So he wishes that the protesters would do the same, so that there would be a dialogue. Yeah. And of course, in a veiled defense of the royal institution, he said Thailand has come this far because of the contribution by all the major establishments or major institutions that have existed hundreds of years. And without this institution, Thailand would not be a country as it is today. And as we all know, that one of the major demands of the protesters is a sweeping reform of the monarchy. And this is something that certainly doesn't go down with the Prime Minister, who is known as a staunch loyalist.
Today, he emphasized that he is preparing to lift state of emergency decree if there is no violence, and he would like protesters to have dialogue and try to talk to the government and seek the way out. That is what he was addressing with the whole nation.
Now, for the past few days, the rallies usually break up or end at about 8 p.m. But we have no idea as to what will happen tonight, whether they will stick to the schedule they have been following the past few days, or they have other plans. This something is still a mystery. And as we have been saying that there is no clear leadership of the protest, and including tonight's rally near the government house. So we still cannot find out exactly from anyone at the rally site as to what the next step will be.
Looking back, Kun Thepchai, on 16th of October was the day that we saw how riot police used high pressure water jet tank to disperse the protester. That happened on Friday night, and I believe that tonight people are watching quite closely what's the decision that the police officer are going to make in order to disperse the protester or not.
It's quite, if you notice that in the rallies the past few days, there has been a conspicuous absence of police forces. So the protesters were allowed to carry on with activities unhindered. And so certainly the government has been careful not to repeat what happened last Friday when they used high-pressure water cannons to break up the rally at the Patumban intersection. So this is the latest from the Urupong intersection, where thousands of people are still rallying.
They met at Victory Monument today, and they are marching to the government house, and this is on the way between Victory Monument and the government house. They are now stopping at Urupong intersection, and all the way from Victory Monument to the government house, the distance is about 3 kilometers.
And our reporters have just reported that the protesters are now facing the last line of defense of the government house. But of course, as we have been saying, that we still don't know what the intention of the protester is now. Will they try to march forward, or will they stick to the schedule that they have been following the past few nights? I mean, breaking up, going home at 8 p.m.
Yeah, it happened from Sunday that they met at about 4, 5 o'clock, and then they dispersed. They stopped the gathering together at about 8 p.m. and it has been on until today, and we have to see it's right now 8 p.m. whether they will call off the
Will they change?
protest tonight.
What are their strategy? So let's wait for it.
Our correspondent,
I'll show you the
Kittipat, is still there, trying to make sense of what is going on, and of course he will file in his reports when he knows exactly what is going to happen.
Yes.
It looks like many of the protesters are well prepared with hard hats, with raincoats and everything.
Yes, and they have their way to arrange different colors of their hat and the raincoat. And the front line between protester and police officer right now, as far as you can see, the majority of protesters wearing white hats, and they said they seek for volunteers to be the front lines of the protester, to be standing off with the police officers.
We have to say that the rallies over the past few nights have been largely peaceful. There was one ugly incident 2 nights ago at Bang Na intersection, but it had nothing to do with the protesters themselves, but to some drunken onlookers who happened to be joining the protest for some reason, and ended up attacking a police kiosk, and he was later apprehended the next morning. But otherwise, I mean, the rallies have been peaceful, and the protesters were well behaved and were very orderly. They came and they went without any untoward incidents at all.
And right now we see police car, police van in the area.
So these are supposed to be members of the security units of the protesters. They are always at the front line. And facing them, of course, 100 meters away is the last line of defense of the government house.
And during the day, there was some decision by the court, Kuntepchai, regarding the order to close Voice TV. But finally, the court canceled the request by Ministry of Digital Economy and Society.
The Voice TV, even though its name is Voice TV, it doesn't really have any terrestrial TV channel. Its outlets are all on online, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on the internet. And the outlets were accused of reporting information and images that were threatening the public good order and peace and order. So the ministry that looks after the digital economy and society asked the court to order a shutdown of these outlets of Voice TV. But the court decided today that shutting down these outlets would be a violation of the Constitution, which guarantees press freedom and prohibits any closure of the media outlets. So it was quite a unique decision by the court in defense of press freedom. And then that means that the three other media outlets that were targeted for shutdown by the ministry certainly would also be spared. It looks like the case of the Voice TV served as a precedent. And the other three, the court ruled that the ministry did not provide enough evidence or information to justify their shutdown. So that means that these four media outlets that were the targets of closure by the ministry would be able to continue to do the duty.
Yes. And the way they arranged to meet today among protesters are quite interesting, because they would announce that in the beginning that at noon time they would meet at nearby train station at about 2 o'clock, earlier than previous days. And then later, at about nearly 4 o'clock, they announced that they were going to meet at Victory Monument. And also the people at two secondary venues for today's protest, one near Bangkok Mall and another at Ramkhamhaeng University. And demonstrations are also planned in at least 5 other provinces. And at Ramkhamhaeng University today in the afternoon, late afternoon, it turned violent at some point, Kuntepchai, because there were a group of people who wear yellow shirts and a group of Rasadon group were having standoff at Ramkhamhaeng University.
Yeah, there was a brief scuffle between the two groups. Luckily, there was a large presence of police there, so the policemen were able to separate the two groups before there was any more violence. There was no report of injuries. We haven't heard of any reports of injuries yet. Of course, it's quite obvious that the Thai society is presently quite polarized by the ongoing political conflict. And Ramkhamhaeng has always been known as a hotspot of student activism. And this time, there are two different groups subscribing to different political ideas. The ones to see in yellow shirts are the self-proclaimed royalists who came out today first to organize a press conference to denounce the protesters demanding for a reform of the royal institution. And they later confronted a small group of protesters who were preparing to rally on the campus.
And today we could say that yellow shirt groups are quite active in coming out to show support to the monarchy. And in addition to Ramkhamhaeng University, that they were nearly having standoff with the protesters of Rasadon group, yellow shirt or royalist supporters also gathering at other provinces around Thailand.
So these are some of the leaders of the royalist groups that make their presence felt on the campus of Ramkhamhaeng. They said their purpose today was to show their opposition to the protesters demanding a reform of the monarchy.
Yeah. Totally, they have three main demands among protesters of the demonstration of Rasadon group. They call for the resignation of the Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, a new constitution, and the third one, the most crucial point, is to reform of the monarchy. That's the three demands by Rasadon group.
All right, they still stand off at the Urupong intersection near the government house.
The situation was quite tense since at about before 7 o'clock, and at 7 o'clock sharp, Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha had a live address to the whole nation. And he asked for protesters to step back, and the other group step back as well, and he tried to say that he will cancel or withdraw state of emergency decree if no violence happens.
So the front line of the protest start moving and start rallying again to the House of Government.
It looks like the vanguard of the protest, making up mostly the security, the people are on the march. They are at the forefront of the protest column.
And according to Thai PBS Twitter right now, some police officers retreated back to the government house direction, in which another group of protesters are waiting at Nang Leung intersection, and they try to be joining with a group of protesters at Urupong intersection. So that means right now there are two groups of protesters at Nang Leung intersection and Urupong intersection, in which Nang Leung is not far from Urupong.
Judging from the speech of the Prime Minister tonight, it doesn't look like the government is in the position or is ready to really make any compromise. But the point that the Prime Minister was trying to make is for the protester to show restraints and wait for the legislative branch to do its work in debating a way out for the conflict. But if you listen to the reaction from some of the protest organizers, it's clear that they don't have that patience. They certainly wouldn't count on the work of the members of parliament to solve the conflict that is facing the country now. They have insisted on their demands for the Prime Minister to resign and for a new constitution to be drafted, and nothing short of those.
And according to Thai PBS News Twitter, the protester at the mall Bangkok department store called off the protest, called off the demonstration at the department store, the mall Bangkok, at about 8 p.m. and they asked protesters to go home.
It looks like some of the protesters, at least, the vanguard at least, are marching further toward the government house. It's unclear whether they intend to face the police and try to break through the barriers to reach the gates of the government house, as they did Wednesday
in
night.
front of the front line of the protest, going to show you what's going to happen in the near future tonight. They're saying so, that means keep fighting. What? All right.
No.
คุณกิติพัฒน์ is reporting live for Thai PBS World and he just right in front of the line of the protesters.
Protester who was in the very front line. Yes.
You are watching special edition of Thai PBS World. Tonight we are following the standoff between protester and police officer at Urupong intersection, which has been on for more than an hour already. And protester plan to be moving from Victory Monument to the government house, and right now they are in the middle of the direction between Victory Monument to the government house at Urupong intersection. So now let's take a look at what's going on right now.
So how about on the left side? Still pausing. Okay, so they start moving again. They start having a rally again. So the traffic inside the city is quite very heavy. So for anyone who wants to use the traffic here, I suggest to go to another route.
At about 8:15 at Yomaraj intersection, Pisanulok Road, it was reported by Thai PBS reporters that a group of protesters are heading toward Nang Leung intersection. And the protesters have already gone through the line of the police officer.
It's now 8:22 p.m. and normally by this time the protester would have broken up and gone home, but tonight is different. Probably this could be the big surprise they promised to deliver yesterday.
And right now, the march to the government house continues.
But it looks like the protesters are being stopped by the defense line, and some of them, as we have seen earlier, they are taking a sort of a detour. But the
Yes.
destination still remains the same, is the government house.
And there was a report that the crowd tried to break the line at one police line after approaching from different directions and prompting the police officers to retreat. And there was a report of injury case at Yomarat intersection. And our reporter reported that a big group of protesters have arrived at Nang Leung horse race track or Sanam Ma Nang Leung. Another group of protesters has already arrived at Nang Leung race horse track. And that's the spot which is not far from Government House. At about 8:25, it's reported that a big group of protesters arrived at Sanam Ma Nang Leung or Nang Leung horse race track. And it's not far from Urupong intersection and Yomarat intersection.
We'll let you stay with the picture in case there are more developments. But as we have been reporting that the intention of the protester is to march toward the government house. But since the areas around the seat of the government are being blocked by police, so the protesters are finding way to try to circumvent the defense line.
Yeah. So from the direction of the protester, they would like to march to the government house, but right now they are blocked by police officers who have set up the line, and there was a report of small crash between protester and the police line, reporting of some injury. And the latest is another big group of protesters have arrived at Sanam Ma Nang Leung or Nang Leung horse race. And right now, the police officer have to retreat to the government house direction. And you can see how protesters ride on motorcycles.
The group of protesters marching toward the government house from another direction.
Yeah. And this happened just 1.5 hours after Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha addressed to the whole nation begging protesters not to have any violence, not to have any standoff with the police officer, and he said he is preparing to lift up state of emergency decree if no violence happens.
So this looks like a repeat of what happened on the October the 14th, when thousands of protesters marched from the Democracy Monument toward the government house and confronted the police there. So this is another angle of the protest.
And according to the protester, this is the big surprise that they have mentioned that today they would have a big surprise, and the big surprise in this case means to be marching through the government house.
Because I have no knowledge in Japanese, but thank you very much for your translation. All right. All right, here. These are the obstacle of the protest, which is the two bus blocking the street, two buses blocking the route where the protest will be using to go to the House of Government. So I'm moving inside behind the bus. So let's see what's in the next side. And if we see what's over that in the next side, so we can.
At about 7:40, there was a standoff between police officer and protester at Urupong intersection.
As you can see on the picture, it looks like at least some of the protesters are now just very close to the government house now. Between them are police vans and some barbed wires. In the background is the seat of the government.
Yes. So right now, the two groups of protesters are trying to converge and moving toward the government house. Another big group of protesters met at Nang Leung intersection and to be converging with another group at Urupong intersection. And according to the standoff between protester and police officer at about 2014, it's reported there are two cases of injury, one man and a woman, just below the Passover expressway at Yomarat intersection.
Okay, so
You're watching special edition of Thai PBS World tonight. We are now updating with the latest situation of the standoff between protester and police officer. And right now, the situation is quite tense because protesters are trying to move toward the government house, and the police officer have to retreat their line from Urupong intersection to move toward government house area, and that's where police officers are trying to mobilize as many forces as possible right now to protect the government house and to set up the line.
Now the first group of protesters are now just few meters away from the government house, being separated by the last line of police defense and some police vans and barbed wires. But we don't know exactly what the next step of the protesters will be, whether they will try to break the barriers or the defense line as they did last week.
Yes. The disperse of the protester happened last Friday on 16th of October, and that was the first night that we saw how riot police used high pressure water jet tank to try to disperse the crowd. And we are monitoring and following the situation whether they will use the same format tonight.
In his speech tonight, the Prime Minister did make a reference to the cracked down on the protesters last week. He said it was a scene that nobody would want to see happen. It was sad, and he said that the protest would not always produce the results that the protester might have desired. And he also admitted that the strong arm tactics used by the government also are not supposed to solve the problem all the times. And then he went on to call on both the government and the protester to step back from the brink.
Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha tried to offer protesters to de-escalate from the situation, and he offered that he would like to prepare to lift up state of emergency decree in case there is no more violence. But it turns out that it seems clear that protesters probably didn't listen to his plea of de-escalation of the protest. And right now we can see how protesters are moving toward the government house.
Now there's a live feed from the areas next to the government house. As you can see that thousands of protesters now are slowly marching toward the seat of the government. We'll let you stay with the picture.
And there is breaking news, Kun Thepchai, that there is royal order to calling for parliament session.
It's going to be an extraordinary parliamentary session to debate the ongoing conflict.
Yeah. On the 26th of October, there is royal order to call for extraordinary parliament session on 26th of October. And that was an attempt that MPs, especially from opposition camps, are trying to make a request to have this extraordinary parliament session.
And in this speech tonight, the Prime Minister said that is exactly the channel for the conflict to be resolved. That is the extraordinary House session in which both members of both the House of Representatives and Senate will sit down and then discuss the ongoing conflict and try to find a way out.
Yes, so we shall see whether protesters would have heard of this royal order, that the royal order grant to have extraordinary parliament session on 26th of October.
That's next Monday and Tuesday.
And there is a report that at Chamai Maruchet Bridge next to the government house, the police officer have already prepared high pressure water jet tank car. That's the report from Thai PBS Twitter. So right now, police force have already prepared high pressure water jet tank not far from the government house. And we can see from the image on the screen, Kun Thepchai, protesters have been wearing raincoats, different colors of raincoats, and they have formed up their own lines.
And as you can see that many, if not most, of the protesters are young. Many certainly are university and high school students who have been taking part in the series of protests over the past few months. So the rallies have been going on since the middle of last week, after the rally at the Democracy Monument, which later moved on to the Government House before it broke up. But the highlight was the next night when the rally at the Pathumban intersection, and there was a police crackdown with police using high-pressure water jets against the protester. It was a crackdown that was widely condemned. So now the protesters are confronting the police the force in front of the Government House now. But the protesters are not showing any signs that they're going to move forward from that point.
It's very crowded, and you can see how protesters form up their own front line to be facing with the government, with the police officers. And some of them have prepared umbrella. And on 16th of October, the night that the police officer dispersed the crowd, dispersed the protester, the front line of protesters also used umbrella to try to protect themselves. And right now we can see how front line of protesters, some of them is shouting at the police officers.
As we have been saying that tonight's rallies, still doesn't have a clear leadership, so we don't know exactly who are leading the protests and who can speak on behalf of them, the protesters, and what the next step of the protester will be.
And at 8:40, it's reported that protesters from Urupong intersection have been marching along the road to try to converge with another group at the Government House, and they shouted at each other. It's the way that they communicate with one another, that to walk in the line and marching toward the Government House.
Seen in the background is the Government House.
And as far as Kun Thepchai explained, we don't know who the leaders are, but there are some volunteers who volunteer to be at the front, and they are like security guard or the guard of the protester. And Thai PBS Twitter reported that, in quote, that he said, protesters are willing to be in good order, so it's not necessarily for the guard to try to make order for them, because they know what they have to do. That's according to the guard, volunteer guard for the protesters.
We can say with certainty that the rallies we have been seeing the past few nights, including the one tonight, probably have one of the most orderly of all the rallies we have seen. Well organized, and the protesters themselves have been well disciplined. So this is the first time that Thailand has this kind of protest of this nature. Certainly it fits the definition of so-called flash mob. It means a gathering of people arranged through social media.
And you can see how some of the protesters were on top of the bus, and it's reported that some of them are leaders of a group called Revival of Democracy.
east side.
Of course, we need to remind you that most, if not all, of the leaders we know have been taken into custody on various charges.
Some of the leaders of the protester were on top of the rooftop of the bus, and it's blocked the way to the government house, and they are using the loudspeaker to try to communicate with other protesters and other leaders of protesters.
So now the
Certainly, the protesters have problem with the sound system because of the nature of the protest, which was hastily arranged. So they have problem with the communicating with the protesters. So sometimes they use words of mouth, to pass on messages. And it looks like those on top of the buses are trying to communicate with the protester with some written message.
Yeah.
On a piece of paper.
And currently, the leader of the protesters who were on the roof of the bus, they announced that at 7 p.m., Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha asked protesters to step back and asked all the party concerned to step back and prepare to lift up state of emergency decree. And the leader said they are ready to step back, but Prime Minister has to resign. And the white paper that you could see is the form of resignation letter to Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha. And right now they announced for the protesters who are behind, the line behind, to try to come forward. This is very close to the government house. They are just right in front of the government house. And you could see the national flag at the government house.
Of course, in conditions like this, it must be very difficult for the protest organizers to communicate with the protesters. They don't have a well-prepared sound system, so all they have now is the microphones. That certainly the sound wouldn't reach the majority of the protesters.
It must be quite chaotic, but mainly protesters tend to communicate with one another via Telegram application. That's the way, that's the outlet that they talk to one another.
Thai PBS reporters had talked to some of the protesters, especially those in front of the column, to try to find out exactly what the next step would be, and nobody could give an answer. One main question is whether or not they plan to camp out overnight at this spot, or maybe a spot closer to the government house, but nobody can give an answer to that.
At about 7 p.m., Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha addressed the whole nation, and he offered to prepare to lift up state of emergency if protesters do not escalate the situation. That was before they arrived at the government house. And right now you can see how protesters just get together at the government house, and some of the leaders are communicating with protesters, and they said they heard what's the message from the Prime Minister, but they also asked for Prime Minister to resign before they take one step back. And we also got report that there is high pressure water jet tank in the area not far from the government house. And we are following up the situation, whether it will repeat the same scene that we saw on 16th of October when police officer dispersed the crowd at Ramawan Road. So tonight is different from a few nights ago, Kun Thepchai, because this is the big surprise from the protesters that they marched from Victory Monument to the government house. They didn't announce this in advance.
It looks like somebody is taking charge of the rally and is about to address the crowd and to tell them what the next step will be. But so far, the only thing that those on the top of the buses are saying is that they will not budge from their demand for General Prayut to resign.
And about 15 minutes ago, there was royal order for extraordinary parliament session, which will take place on 26th of October. And right now, protesters must have known of this royal order already because the leader of the protesters are trying to communicate. And they just informed the protesters that they would like to take the bus out of the area. So according to our reporter, the protesters say that it's a victory already that they have arrived at the government house tonight.
So now, both police and protesters.
So our reporters on the scene have reported that the protest organizers and probably one or two who have identified themselves as protest leaders are trying to set up a system to communicate with the protesters.
So if they retreat from the government house, probably it means that addressing of the whole nation by Prime Minister has played a crucial role as well, Kun Thepchai, especially his promise to withdraw state of emergency decree, and also we heard that royal order has already issued for extraordinary parliament session on 26th of October, and that was the opposition camps MP are trying to call for extraordinary house session. One of the leaders who appear right now is Gorakot Sang Yen Pan, nickname Paw.
We have the letters from the Thai PBS news teams on the ground quoting a police officer at the government house as saying that the police have no plans to use the high-pressure water cannons against the protesters tonight, even though a few of the trucks are being seen there.
One of the leaders named Paw Gorakot Sang Yen Pan, and he appeared on the roof of the bus. And he also has a big chunk of documents. And it's reported that it's the documents as a form of resignation letter for the Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha. That's part of the demands by protesters that Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha has to resign.
Latest report from our news team there. As Kunatai just mentioned, a protester by the name of Kolakot Sangyen Pan, a former student of the Kasetsat University, seems to be taking charge of the protest tonight, or at least trying to represent the protest organizers in communicating with the protesters.
You're watching special edition of Thai PBS World tonight, and we are following the tense situation between protester and the police officer at the government house. And we are seeing whether riot police will use high water jet tank to disperse the crowd. And this is some food store which have arrived at the scene, and it's been raised whether they are like having special information, access of special information, because they tend to arrive at the scene quite fast.
In fact, their presence has been a topic of a lot of comments in the Thai media. The presence of these food vendors who never miss any major street demonstrations like this.
Yes, and they've been called CIA of the protesters. We got report that riot police confirm that they will not use high water jet tank to disperse the crowd. The police officer told a group of reporters and confirmed that today they will not use high water jet tank to disperse the crowd.
For those who are curious, the reason why the protesters came in here, because they are standing here in front
So
of the
the
government
security
house
units of the rally are standing guard, putting themselves in between the government house and the rest of the protesters. Because there have been some protesters who might have tried to, or have even tried to sneak through the buses parked as barriers there into the compound of the government house.
At 8:55, the police has not made any further announcement, but the crowd control policies are lining up next to the water truck.
ใจเย็นๆ ใจร่มๆ means keep cool, and that's the message on the banner,
Yeah.
urging the protester to keep cool, not to rush.
So it's their way to communicate to one another.
Yeah, and this could be considered one of the most polite messages so far from the protesters.
Yes. And obviously they cannot use their voice to shout or to let one another know at this spot. That's why they have to have big banner of the word calm down and try to keep cool at this situation.
We are still in the dark, as we have been saying that what the next step of the protester will be, whether they intend to camp overnight at this spot, or will they break up and come back again tomorrow, as they have been doing the past few days and few nights.
And you can see how the protester guards are forming up the line, holding hand of one another to try to protect protesters, and they are volunteer and they are wearing white hat and wearing raincoat as well.
So beyond these two buses is another line of defense comprising barbed wires and police vans. Some of the media representatives have been allowed to go beyond this point. And as Kunata just mentioned, they have talked to some of the police officers there and have been given assurance that they have no plan to use the high-pressure water cannons against the protesters.
So in a way, they prepare quite well, Kun Thep Chai, because the banner are quite large. So protesters who are behind, who are far behind, can read it quite clearly.
Yeah, it's true. Because the nature of the rallies, which we are describing as flash mob, are rallies, gatherings that are arranged hastily, so the system of communication is, the means of communication is always a challenge for them.
Now they take the banner down. The banner which said keep cool and calm, it's down already.
All right, we'll let you stay with the picture for a while before we take a break. And we'll come back again if there is any new development. All right.
Yes.
So we'll see you later then.
Thanks for watching for now.